Well, hello everyone. I'm Gordon Gidland, and I'm so excited today. I'm going to be interviewing my old friend Jordan Musen about his historical novel of biblical times. And so I'm going to speak to him for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to all of you for additional questions. And remember, it's Gordon and Jordan. So keep them straight. There will be a test later. It's a little bit like in the book. You have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So keep that in mind. Uh,
Maybe we can switch roles and I can be you and you can be me.
turn, turn each other around. So well, just as way by way of background, after I read the book, I went to Mary Jo and I thought this is something we should set up some sort of a range, some sort of a discussion about this. The book, in addition to being a ripping good yarn, is so much about yeah, there it is. There's the read about times I think we should be more aware of. And I say this as Christians. I don't think we pay enough attention to the Hebrew Bible. And I know we know Noah, we know Abraham and Sarah, we know Sodom and Gomorrah, but I don't think we know a lot more of it. And obviously, we're into this Jesus guy, and so we're more into the New Testament. But otherwise, I think we really miss out. I mean, there's such rich characters, and I can't get over it. I mean, there's even a talking donkey in the Old Testament, which is, by the way, is the inspiration for Mr. Ed. So that I think that'll come up on Jeopardy. So. Anyway, that's really kind of why I thought it was so great to have Jordan with us and kind of talk about his book. It's just a fascinating read. Well, so I'll kick it off. Alley oop, as the French say. Jordan, can you give us sort of the elevator pitch for the read?
Sure. What if a forgotten, no, let me put it this way. What if the foundational stories of the Bible were written by a forgotten African woman? And what if those stories ultimately led to the destruction of the people she loved the most?
Okay. And how do questions of biblical authorship figure in the book?
Well, I think most of the people here believe, and it makes sense that the words of the Bible are divinely inspired. But the question is, who are the people who actually heard those words and wrote them down? There's a tradition that it's Moses in the Hebrew Bible, but it could be others. We just, there's conflicting evidence. And German scholarship in the 1700s and 1800s, they found four people or four groups of people that wrote much of the Hebrew Bible. For the purposes of this book, I'll mention two of them. One we call the J author. This is an author who uses the Lord whenever they speak of God. And in Hebrew, that's Yahweh. And in German, the translation is Jehovah. And so that's why we have the J, writer J for Jehovah. And these stories take place in the South, in Judah mainly. Um, and they concern a lot of them concern the patriarchs that were important in the South, like Abraham and Jacob. Yeah, I'm sorry, Abraham and Isaac. And then there's another set of stories in the Hebrew Bible where the word for God is Elohim or El. And these German scholars give those stories the authorship to an E writer, E for Elohim. And they take place in the north, and a lot of them concern Jacob and Joseph. And so my protagonist, Keb, starts out writing a set of stories that are these J stories, and then in order to hopefully to prevent a civil war happening, writes another set of stories, these E stories. And so I have her as a J and the E author. I mean, who knows what happened? I mean, maybe they were divinely inspired to men, but why not a woman? So,
Well, speaking of that, how did you approach writing from the perspective of a biracial woman?
Well, I tapped into the biracial, the inner biracial woman in me, I guess. But my protagonist, Keb, just to give a little bit of background, she is the daughter of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So if if the Queen of Sheba is African, which I have Sheba placed in ancient Sudan, she would be biracial. There are some modern day scholars, Harold Bloom and Richard Elliott Friedman, that believe that the J writer is possible, that it could be, sorry, my throat's a little, get a little scratchy. It could be a J writer. Harold Bloom actually was convinced. He was passionate. Was this academic from Yale that died a couple years ago. But he wrote a slew of books, and he was passionate that it had to be a woman. Why a woman? Well, if you look at a lot of the stories that we see through Genesis, that were written by this J writer, a lot of them have to do with the the wives of the patriarchs. There's a lot of stories about Sarah, wife of Abraham. There's a lot of stories about uh, Rebecca, who is the wife of Isaac, and Rachel and Leah, who are the wives of Jacob. And there's a lot of attention to this. In fact, there's this one story with Rachel where she is she and Jacob are running from her father Laban, and they steal the household gods, these idols, and they're in pursuit. And Laban finally catches up to them in their camp, and she hides these idols underneath her riding blanket while she's sitting in her camel in her tent. And Laban rushes in, and he's about to search under those blankets, and she tells him, "Hey, I just menstruated. You may not want to go there." So we have this detailed eye to the feminine. And so Bloom thinks, hey, the writer of these stories really had to be a woman. And so I sort of went with that and made my writer, Keb, who is the wife, I mean, the daughter of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And there's also, there's a lot of stories that have to do with this country called Kush, which I placed right above, which is below Egypt. And so we have a lot of these stories of Cush people throughout the Bible. Moses marries a Cushite wife, for example.
Hmm. Yeah, authors should take care in selecting their title, the title of their book. Can you tell us what about your title? Where did it come
What does the read mean, basically? Another shameless plug to show my book. Um, well, it's metaphoric, and there's like two metaphors that come into play. One is that if you weeds out there in the wild, the wind blows and they kind of bend back and forth, but they don't break. And she's like that. She lives in this patriarchal world. There's a lot of restrictions on what women can do in their place. She accepts those. She's a part of this world. I mean, what we perceive in the modern world with feminism and rights and so forth, that would never occur to her. She has to live where her husband is supreme leader of the house, and in fact is sort of like a mini king. And she has to do what he wants, but yet she doesn't break. She still is uh, head, headstrong and wants to write these stories as a way to cope with a lot of the pain that she's had in her life. It's fodder for her art. So we have that metaphor, and then throughout the book, she is wondering whether these stories come from her or whether she really is just holding the writing instrument. Back then, 3,000 years ago, what you do is you would take a reed, they would fashion it into a writing implement, and you would use that to write on papyrus. So is she God's reed, or is she not? Maybe these stories come from her, and she's wrestling with that throughout the entire book.
Mhm. Okay. So is there a historical there is a historical inspiration for Kim?
Well, somebody had to write these stories, and why couldn't it be Kev? But well, these characters are many of the characters are found right there in the Hebrew Bible. She has this Yoda-like Obi-Wan
Hmm.
mentor named Zadok, and he was a priest under both David and Solomon. In fact, his successors are the Sadducees that we know from Jesus's time.
Hmm.
And there are other characters that are right there in the text that I throw in and make and put them into the book. There, we have obviously no record of a Keb, so maybe I was divinely inspired and I put her in, but or maybe she is a fiction in my mind.
Okay. Yeah, remind me, how many wives did Solomon have?
1,000 or
A
so.
thousand.
So
Okay.
there's a lot of kids running around, and and one of the things I try to do here is, to add some tension and conflict is that she's an outsider and she has to live with her half siblings who are running around the court, and she's an outsider. She's known as a burnt face because she has dark skin, and they tease her and like any kids would tease any other kids, and she finds solace in learning how to read and write, acts that are forbidden to women at the time. But she does this anyway and finds some solace doing that.
Yeah, and that's one of the more resonant sort of themes of the book is this outsider status, and I think many of us can certainly feel for her and for her position. And I was just telling somebody the other day, I don't feel like I belong on this planet. I'm just waiting for the mothership to take me home. But anyway, so historical fiction, as this is, it's certainly difficult. And could you tell us how you approach the task?
Well, your world building. I mean, what I'm doing is similar to what somebody who writes sci-fi or writes fantasy. We're building a world and we want to take the reader and submerge them in this world and make them feel they are part of it, but not to the extent we have so much detail where it's slowing down the read and it's bogging things down, right? So you have facts, and to the extent that you want the facts to be accurate, I think you want to strive for that. But as Oscar Wilde said, you don't want to have facts get in the way of telling a good story, and you want the pages to turn. You want the reader to be involved and find out what's going to be happening next. But if to the extent that I can, I'd like to have the reader, taste what goat stew might taste like, or smell the cedar beams in the palace, or hear the bleating uh, of the sheep. I'm trying to get this the sensory detail, but not in such a way that it's going to slow things down. Um, Now, how do you find these facts? I mean, you do a lot of research, but a lot of this is, a lot of history really is kind of guesswork, right? But I have a chance to put my stamp on what I think the world could have been back then and to show how these stories could have been created.
It must be so difficult too to to manage the voice and trying to sound authentic, sort of old-timey, but also not too obscure, like you're saying, for the make it readable. And I think of this because I have a little experience. I worked as sort of a beta editor for a fellow who was writing a historical novel about the Civil War. And at one point, he had two Civil War generals talking in dialogue, and one said to the other, "We need to spend some quality time." And I wrote to Terry, I said, in 1860, they did have the word quality. They did have the word time. I don't think they had the word quality time. But at the same, but also, but I could sort of understand the impulse that you want to make it relatable. You don't want to make it too like reading Chaucer or something. And so, but that must be really a struggle, right? At times.
Yeah, I really had the urge to have one of the younger characters, one of the kids say 6, 7 throughout the book, but you're right. You're balancing accessibility against making it like you feel like you're in this world that what that took place a couple thousand years ago, a few thousand years ago. So yeah, you're doing this balancing act, and I'm kind of curious because I know that you love Shakespeare. I mean, I think for me, it would be perfectly fine to have like a Shakespeare play without the thous and the thines and the betwixt, to make it more accessible. Um, but a purist probably would cringe if they had a lot of yous and me's.
Oh, don't get us started. Yeah. Well, let me, and on this all historical fiction now, and this is a good question. I mean, in general, I run into this a lot. Some people, why have historical fiction? Why don't you just read the Bible, read the primary sources? Why do you have to go through this? And isn't that enough? How would you respond to that?
Well, you can, but a lot of the biblical text is pretty sparse. It's very efficient, right? We don't really have any descriptions of anybody in the Bible. We know, for example, Saul is very tall. I think they have that as a description, and then everybody else, you have to leave it to the reader's imagination, and things happen very quickly, right? And this whole idea of writing down these stories and encapsulating them, that's missing at all from the text, right? So
Mhm.
uh, I'm having doing what writers have done since the beginning of time, tell a story, have people want to know what comes next. Will the this character be able to escape from these forces that are out to hurt this person, and will they survive to the next ordeal?
Mhm.
So. But yeah, or you can read both. I would encourage people to, take the dust off their Old Testament and read that. I love these stories. That's why I was one of the reasons I wrote this book. I grew up in a Jewish household. We had our Hebrew Bible on the shelf, and I would just love reading the stories from Genesis. My mother was a Hebrew school principal, and she would be trying to cast uh, her students in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and other types of biblical musicals. And I would hear this music being played in our household all the time, and I just fell in love with these stories.
And like you say, it's really not something new. I know I've read about the in the Middle Ages, the rabbis would write midrash or midrashim, and where because the stories were kind of scant, there wasn't enough, and they would fill in details. So
Right.
it's been going on a long time. Um, so what are the themes? What are the themes of the book?
Well, one theme is what Ernest Becker would say would be immortality projects. We all of us have a fear of death, and how do we cope with that? Well, we do that. Many of us do that by producing children. That's a form of immortality, and part of us goes on and escapes death that way. Other people, they put names on buildings and hope the buildings last forever. And others write art or produce art and hope that the art will live on after them. And so that's my main character, Keb. That's one of the things that's going on with her. Her name is not attached to these stories, but the stories are loved by people. They're also misinterpreted by people, which happen and bad things happen because of those misinterpretations. But by and large, the Israelites just love these stories, and she feels as an outsider that finally she's accepted in a way. They don't know it's from her, but uh, she can't be as ostracized if people love her work. The other major theme, this is probably even a more of a theme, and that is, does an artist have any responsibility after their work is let loose in the world? Now, as I just mentioned, when it comes to promises, she writes these stories, they get misinterpreted, and bad things happen. And do I, as a writer or as an author, as an artist, do I have, should I be able to foresee this? Do I have any responsibility? Often when you write art, good things happen that you don't imagine, can't even interpret. I mean, if we go back a couple of decades ago to South Korea when they were under a military dictatorship, There was this writer, this folk singer, Kim Min-ki, wrote this song, Morning Dew. And it was a folk song just about morning dew. But students took this song and made it into this national protest that helped bring about democracy and take down this military dictatorship. So good things can happen that are not intended by the author, but a lot of times bad things happen. A good example, for example, is with Nietzsche. I really sincerely believe he did not have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. He had a friendship with Wagner. He broke that off because Wagner was anti-Semitic. But when he contracted syphilis and he lost his mind, his sister, who was very anti-Semitic and an ultra-nationalist, she took his work and turned that into, edited it, changed it, and turned it into Will to Power, which became the fundamental text for German nationalism and the Nazi movement. And I'm sure that Nietzsche had no idea that that was what's going to happen with his work. And we see this theme also with in science fiction. One of the big drivers of sci-fi stories is it started with Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein builds this creature. The creature somehow escapes and is let loose into the world, and bad things happen. And that really wasn't Frankenstein's intent. And so the same thing here with art. You produce art for one purpose, it gets misinterpreted and used for something really bad. Does the author have any responsibility?
Hmm. Hmm. Now, this next question, I was wondering if you've had any reactions to the book from people maybe find it incendiary because of its religious nature. And I was I asked this question because I want to refer to an incident. And Mary Jo, you'll appreciate this. I was in a Bible study probably about 10, 15 years ago. Mary Jo was leading it. And we were going over some passages, and there were different episodes. And Mary Jo asked the group, well, just as a matter of sort of composition or narrative flow. Why is this episode here? And one person in the group rather indignantly said, because God wanted it there. And Mary Jo said, well, class dismissed. No, she didn't say that. But that you get that reaction. Like, this kind of goes into some of the other questions I have, about historical fiction. I mean, have you had any reactions from people or anyone?
Well, my last book discussion, this was about a month or so ago. I think last month, actually. Someone was extremely upset that I set Sheba in Sudan. She was adamant that it had to be Ethiopia and was really upset with me that I now that by doing this, many Ethiopians would be upset with me that I am destroying their tradition, and how dare I? So,
Have you heard from any rabbis?
um, well, I did. No, nothing from with rabbis where they were upset.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have contacted Rabbi Wilkie from Temple Sinai, and he knows about the book. And but no, I haven't heard any negative reactions yet.
Oh,
So,
great.
but the book has only been out there, so
There's time. There's
there's
time.
time for that to happen, and I'm sure it will.
Um, and then the next question too, and this is for anyone listening who hasn't read the book yet, and it's maybe sort of maybe a trigger in a way, a warning, but it's well, it's not really a spoiler. I mean, Keb has an awful marriage. She has just an awful marriage. It's very difficult to read through. Yeah, she has an awful marriage and she has terrible grief, and this really kind of from the beginning. And was that portrait you mentioned some of the other female characters in the Bible, but was that portrait informed by other characters in the Bible or other situations you're aware of?
Well, it may not be that awful to her. It'd probably be awful to us with our 2026 lens. But I'm sure that what she went through, you know, the vast majority of women probably went through. You had They were living in a patriarchal world, and you see that in the pages of the Bible. The patriarchs aren't always kind to their wives. I mean, we sort of tick through them. Uh, you uh, you have Abraham, and in order to escape the clutches of Pharaoh, when he sort of escapes out there into Egypt, he passes his wife Sarah off as his sister, and
Mm,
then Sarah's not conceiving, so he decides to marry or take as a partner her handmaiden Hagar, and then Hagar has Ishmael, and eventually Sarah conceives, and she gets jealous of Hagar and treats her very badly, and is jealous of Ishmael, so she convinces Abraham to just send Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert with just a flask of water. And there's nothing around there that's going to sustain them. But the Lord steps in and does. And then you have Isaac. I mean Isaac with Rebecca, and uh, Isaac has a favorite son, Esau, and doesn't treat Rebecca, the other son, Isaac, very well. Um, and Rebecca sort of fights back. And then with Jacob and Rachel, he loves Rachel, but he first has to marry Rachel's sister Leah, and who he doesn't love. And he doesn't dote on any of Leah's children. He only dotes on Rachel's children. So we have a lot of patriarchs uh, performing badly, behaving badly, right?
mm.
So it's right there in the pages of the Hebrew Bible that you're living in this world where the patriarch's word is in a sense God in the household. He's the king, and women have to be submissive usually. Now, it's not all horrible with my protagonist Kev. I mean, sometimes her husband, does nice things, but like all the characters, there's good and bad in everyone. If you had someone perfectly good and someone or some other characters perfectly bad, you're not going to have a great story, right? Everyone has shades of gray.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going kind of through a reading binge of Jane Austen, and if you think about women characters being in awkward situations, that you also have her. So now the book has it's great. You know, the book has references to Gilgamesh as well as the Canaanite gods, and even I know once to Zeus, and a reference to Prometheus and Oedipus. So you do imagine this ancient world is rather cosmopolitan.
Well, she is her mentor is the royal librarian, so she has access to all these scrolls from around the world, I would imagine. And plus, as far as the Canaanite gods, well, the Israelites were worshiping these Israelite gods. We know that from the Hebrew text. First of all, we have in the Ten Commandments, we have the commandment, "Thou shalt worship no other gods but me." So obviously, the Israelites must have been worshiping other gods. And then with Elijah, right, he has this big battle against the priests of Baal. Baal's a Canaanite god, and he wins. But why would these priests be there if they didn't have a congregation of people that were worshiping Baal? So it's obvious from the pages that there's a lot of polytheism that was going on, and the authors were on a mission to have eventually to try to create monotheism, which is what we ended up having. But it took some time for that.
Yeah, one little bit I was just reading the other day, and I think it's such a neat little scene. And I don't think this is a spoiler or anything if you've ever read the book, but and forgive me, Jordan, if I'm revealing to you, you had a past life as a screenwriter, and I'm wondering this one scene always struck me as having a cinematic aspect almost. There's a part where Keb is, I believe it's Talus is one of the learned people. Keb has already learned Hebrew by this time, but they've come across the Gilgamesh story, and they say, well, wait, there's a flood here with not Pishtim, and we've got our flood story with Noah. Did we steal it from them, or did they steal it from us? So
Right.
it's a neat little scene, but it makes you, it's almost like they're, like a current, like modern day people in the lab trying to figure something out. So there's that. But also it's really there was a news story. It reminds me too. There's a news story maybe a month or two ago where there was an excavation in Egypt, and they brought up a mummy, and the mummy had a section of Homer's Iliad with him. And so it just shows that there must have been a globalization before we had globalization, I suppose. But
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, and a lot of the Hebrew Bible stories say there's parallels in Greek stories, for example, as you mentioned, with Prometheus. A lot of that this he gives knowledge which is fire to humanity, and for that he gets punished and is placed on this rock and this boulder and is being picked to death by vultures at night, and then his intestines grow back, and then he goes through it day after night, day and night after over and over again, and that's very similar to our Garden of Eden story, right, with Eve and the apple.
Mhm. Well, Jordan, I mean, you've done a lot of background work. We're just curious, how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, I've been spending decades really just learning about biblical authorship and studying Judaica. But when it came down to actually sitting down and writing, I think the draft came up pretty quickly, about maybe 6 to 9 months was the first draft, and then I would be spending a lot of time tinkering with that. You kind of have to, as a writer, you want to put it aside as long as possible and then pick it up with fresh eyes. Otherwise, you're going to still fall in love with your old mistakes, right? So, but it's going through many different drafts, and I had workshopped the book and had a lot of people look at it, and authors who are successful look at it and give me advice, and I've taken that and made changes.
Oh, great, great. Well, what's next? What's your next project?
I'm thinking about writing something in ancient Greece, and here's a possible log line. Um, History tells us that Athens was defeated by Spartan spears, but what really destroyed Athens was this war between two madams. So that's these two brothel owners are bringing down the city of Athens. So that's maybe the next book.
Oh, great. That's great. So, well, I mean, at this point, I can open it up to, does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question for Jordan?
Mary Jo.
So I have a page full of notes here, and I don't want to this conversation. But number one, those of you who know me and have ever been in a Bible study with me know that I have said for years that if reincarnation is a thing, I'm coming back as an Old Testament scholar. So when you were talking about how much you enjoy and grew up with those stories, that really resonates with me. And y'all know I have a real bias in favor of the Old Testament. Mike, I had not thought of the title um, as something that bends but doesn't break. I had gone right to the obvious. This is the instrument that she used, and so that gives me a whole nother perspective of trying to kind of rethinking some of that. I really appreciate that thought, but first of all, for people that don't really know, can one of you explain Gilgamesh, what that is? Because that plays a role in this, but I'm not sure everybody here knows what that is.
Want me to? I can answer that. Gilgamesh is a Babylonian epic that has come down to us. It's probably it was first written thousands of years ago, uh, even a thousand or two, 2,000 years, a few thousand years, maybe even before the events of this novel take place. But Gilgamesh is a king of a city called Uruk in ancient Sumer, and he has an ego, and he wants to be immortal, and so he's on this quest for immortality, and on this quest he finds a friend that is created by the gods called Enkidu, And at first they have this big battle. Enkidu, by the way, is like half man, half beast. He's very uncivilized. And I'm not sure who makes the decision, but there's a prostitute that spends an evening with Enkidu, and after that he becomes civilized for some reason. I make what you want out of that part of the epic, but they have this big fight, and then they become friends. They're best friends for life. They're BFFs, and together they search for immortality. And on that quest, they find this very old guy that is a survivor of the Babylonian flood. And he asks the survivor for the secret of immortality. And he says, I don't have a secret, but I can give you this weed that if you take it, will give you back your youth. And he's about to take the weed, but he falls asleep. And the weed is someone snatches the weed. I think it's an animal or something. And so he loses that, but he returns back to Uruk and he realizes that, well, maybe he won't have immortality, but he can find immortality in in his city, in the walls of the city, that will go on forever. So again, it gets back to this theme of finding immortality projects. Maybe I can't be immortal, but maybe I can build a city that will last forever. And that will be that's how I will escape death.
So basically it's a Babylonian, it's an ancient Babylonian text. That question is, did Babylon steal it from Hebrew or did Hebrew steal it from Babylon? Because I know there are some other stories in Genesis that are maybe complementary. I won't say opposite, but the creation story comes to mind where Gilgamesh's was pretty violent, and ours, we did a whole creation. We looked at a bunch of different creation stories. This was maybe thought of as an anti-Gilgamesh, a
Well,
Hebrew version, less violent, and the god that was involved was much more caring. Yeah. Um, have you had any? I can't imagine that an evangelical Christian would enjoy this. I think it would just piss them off. So, have you had any reaction from that community?
not yet. But yeah, Solomon is not a nice guy. I'm sure that would piss him off. Oh, the fact that a woman was heard these divine words might piss them off. It should be a man, right?
Details are correct as we have them written, not made up by some girl on a boat. So, that was just a curious, I wonder. Gordon, you mentioned that a mummy was found with a scrap. Was it the Odyssey?
The Iliad
I
in
hadn't
in
read that.
Greek, and that was in an Egyptian mummy, which apparently they were reading Greek down there, and the fact that they put it in they found it with the mummy must have meant a lot to that person. That must have been a real token for them.
And the Greeks were inspired by the Egyptians.
Mm. Yeah.
Their statues were all based on Egyptian statues. Their columns based on Egyptian columns. Their architecture, their art was just borrowed from the Egyptians. They thought, in fact, the ancient Greeks thought the Egyptians were a better civilization because they were older and wiser.
Mm.
Makes sense. As historical fiction, sometimes people read historical fiction as historical documentary, and they think that some of the dramatic license that is taken is actual fact. Have you had anyone question how could that really happen?
Not yet, but what do we really know about history? I mean, well, there's this quote attributed to Napoleon that history is a lie agreed upon. I mean, let's say you take Rome, you have texts written by contemporary historians, but they all had biases. We think Caligula was a monster, right? But it's really Tacitus, the historian, who made him that way only because maybe he was a monster, but maybe it was that Caligula didn't like the Senate and did a lot of things that upset the Senate. And Tacitus, the historian, was also a senator, so he probably heard a lot of these rumors and without corroborating that, made that historical fact. So a lot of what we take as guesswork take as history is guesswork with a lot of biases thrown in as well. So we don't really know. I mean, we think we know what happened during Henry VIII's reign and the Tudors and all his queens and Cromwell and all that, but we don't know really. I mean, there's a lot that we're just speculating about. I mean, who knows what's going on currently, with, with other people. We read the news, but a lot of times the news has errors, right? Um, so I think there's room to expand, and there's always been expansions of everything. You have it's just the way culture is. We used to have a reindeer set without Rudolph, but now in the 1930s, a song came out, a poem came out, and now he is up there with all the other, he's the most important reindeer, and we can't even remember who the other reindeers are, right? But until 1930, he didn't exist. So culture is always changing.
I like that.
And if I could give one good example from Jordan's book, I mean, I'm not going to give anything away, but he describes probably what the most famous tale of Solomon is about the two women who come to him about the baby, contesting parentage of the baby. But Jordan really puts a really different twist on the whole thing. We have that bare story, but it's so neat the little perspective he puts on it. So.
Well, the story
Mark,
in the text in the Bible it's not that long, right?
Yeah.
Nothing is really that long, so there's always room for interpretation and expansion.
Margaret has a question.
Yeah, well, I really enjoy historical fiction as far the Bible stories. I agree, it's really sparse. You want to read, well, what happened next? What was the outcome? And after reading The Red Tent and about the women's, what was the culture was like. We always want to know a little bit more about the culture, what was happening. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I think the Hebrew Jewish women that I know enjoy that, discussion. But I'm questioning why you chose to be to the protagonist as a woman or women in the Bible. I'm glad you did, but also a little bit of a challenge, maybe for add or detract Bible, that's so really enjoy it. Enriches the stories. It makes the Bible come alive for me. I can visualize what's going on especially the Old Testament by biblical history that you presented. But why did you choose the women to be your?
Well, I wanted to try to find a very marginalized, sympathetic hero that has challenges so the reader can identify with that character. And I thought if I had this biracial woman from Africa who had a whole set of challenges just based on her appearances, she's this burned face that her half brothers and half sisters make fun of. That you'd have an extremely marginalized figure that has to overcome challenges. As an author, you want to create tension and conflict, and in order for the engine of the story to go forward, you want to have the problem solved, but after that solution, that creates another problem that has to be solved. And if you look at any, if you books that work and movies that work always have this engine of going from good to bad, good to bad, good to bad to drive the plot through. And it helps if your character to do that is good at one thing. You want that, usually with your character. And here she's like this amazing, most talented writer ever. And second is to have the hero as an underdog. And I don't think you can get really much more of an underdog that we can relate to than someone who is a woman who is dark skinned, living in this Caucasian um, patriarchal world. There's a whole set of challenges and a whole set of tensions that I can take advantage of to make my story move forward.
So how does she, we'd like to know a little bit more about how she was able to take the lessons to learn how to read, how to write in such a patriarchal society. Can you explain that in your story?
Yeah, yes, yeah, of course. She's not like she's like hit by lightning and she knows how to read and write. She as she lives most of her first 7 or 8 years in a ranch outside the capital of Sheba because the king of Sheba wants nothing to do with her. She's, illegitimate kid from his wife, and because of an incident with the King and Queen of Sheba's daughter, which is a friend of hers, or sort of a friend of hers, which where Cat treats her badly. She's sent away to live with her Jewish father. And so she takes this trip up the Nile, and from that trip, she learns a lot of stuff that will eventually inspire her. But she has a stop in Memphis, in Thebes, where she runs away from the ship because the captain is treating her poorly, and she is sort of taken under the wing for a few moments by a priest there who teaches her her shows her her name in an Egyptian cartouche in the sand, what the Egyptian hieroglyphs would look like, and then he puts a circle around it. And when you put a circle around a name in Egyptian, it's like the pharaoh. So here she is, she's Queen Kev in the sand there for a moment, and then eventually she's brought back onto the ship and she's brought to Jerusalem. But someone has to take care of her and sort of teach her Jewish customs, teach her Hebrew, and Solomon decides that the only person that would take her would be this librarian, the royal librarian. Uh, and he secretly, and there's a reason why he does this, but he secretly teaches her how to read and write, not only Hebrew, but a number of languages. And she has access to all these scrolls in the royal library. So she really becomes learned, and that helps her. And then she decides, okay, I'm going to take a stab at trying to write my own story. And of course, the first story that she writes is horrible, and she burns it, right, like anybody would, because it's their first attempt. But eventually, she becomes very, very good at her craft.
John, did you have a question?
Um, I'm talking, I'm, well, I'm just know about what, how many was, um, Jerusalem has, it's in Jerusalem, but I'm, I'm not sure when did Noah, because in the story, because Noah has a family like a long time. And from that, it's like a long time. And he has Noah's family was born like a long time, and they were they turn adults, right?
Yeah. So how did we get from Noah and his family to what's happening in Jerusalem in the time of the story?
Yeah.
Okay. So Keb, I don't want to speak for you, Jordan, but I think the question is, how did Noah play a part in this book, and how did we get from Noah's family and the flood story to where we are during the time that this book is set? And I think that Keb is looking back and writing down or creating these stories based on what she has learned and been told. And
Right.
we don't start in that time frame. We're just kind of looking back and hearing the stories about that time. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that's right. At the time when she's there, which is 930 BC, which would be long after Noah, there's fragments of what happened with the Israelites in what I call the harp songs, many of which are become the Psalms. And in these songs, it's just like fragments of what goes on. So she takes, just like I'm taking the liberty of taking small pieces of text in the Bible and making that into a story. She's doing the same thing. She's taking fragments of these songs, which don't really go into a lot of detail, and then she's fleshing that out, and she's creating an origin story for her people, including Noah.
Did someone else have a question, Joanne?
Well, I was just gonna comment, I'm only halfway through the book, but it took me a while to realize that she was just a little girl.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's a reminder that we always wonder, who are the survivors and how did they survive? Which we talked about the resiliency and, her determination. But all of a sudden I realized, oh, she's only 8 years old. I was
Well,
really surprised.
well, what I did was I had the first part of the book. I wanted to sort of hook the reader. So she's an adult, and she ends up in a place where she's not supposed to be, and then she gets rescued by by Zadok, who ends up being like her mentor, and he asked her to tell her how she came up with these stories. So then the second part of the book, uh, we start at an earlier time where she's 7 turning 8, and then we go from there chronologically.
I particularly enjoyed the traveling up the Nile, realizing that so much depended on for boundaries and for survival on whatever nature was going to do,
Yeah.
one way or the other. I just really felt like I took that trip, and I was watching what she observed along the way. It was very exciting, that part.
Okay, great. I'm glad you enjoyed that. That worked out. That worked for you.
Texture, it was like, oh, wow, I'd go there.
Yeah. You did a lot of research, Jordan. It was good.
Thank you.
I'd like to comment that in our Tuesday morning Bible class, because Mary Jo is Mary Jo, we've been doing a lot of comparing and contrasting different versions of writers' work in the Bible, or different parts of, and we bring maybe 3 or 4 Bibles at a time, or several origin stories, and
Mhm.
discuss, compare and contrast how they're written and why. And it's just been so helpful. It's really been.
Great. I'm glad you're doing that. I mean, I just love these stories, and a lot of this is just sort of it's a tribute to them, and I, I know I could just go on and on about Jacob and Joseph, and to me it's magic, and I was that really was one of the prods here to write this, because it's an homage to the biblical text, which I think is just one of the greatest pieces of literature ever.
It says a lot about what stories survive. I know Lily has mentioned that. And when all is said and done, some stories have survived a long time. And then it's meaning for us. It has.
Thank you for that. Any other questions for Jordan or Gordon? Gordon, I really appreciate that you suggested this. This has been really, this has been fun for me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for participating. What's
And thank
next?
you all for having me. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed discussing this and meeting you all, and working with Gordon and Mary Jo on the project here. So thank you again.
Erin, you had your hand up.
I do. It has nothing to do with the book, but I love connections. So Jordan and Gordon, how did you meet?
We're old colleagues, old friends and old colleagues. We were in the government. Well, Jordan's still in the government. I'm gone, but yeah, we were in IRS council for many years, and I've been in. And it's funny. I was just thinking today how Jordan. Do you remember that sort of mock trial you put together with Ed Robbins, and I
Right.
put the incompetent expert witness. So we put, and so we've been involved with a number of things over the years, and that's how we know each other.
Thank you.
And it was so neat when we're LinkedIn connections, that platform LinkedIn, and I think that's where I saw you mentioning the book, and I thought, wow, Jordan wrote a book. It must be on tax procedure. And, and so I got it and I said, oh, this is incredible, incredible. What a page turner. And so, yeah, that's why I was really, really jazzed about it all.
But
So
the reasons why the Northern Kingdom separated from Judah is because of a tax revolt.
exactly, exactly. And I forget who was the tax collector that Rehoboam threw the wolves.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank too.
I don't know
He's
why.
in there though.
But it's funny. I was just reading the section where Rehoboam goes to Shechem, and then they start. He thought he's get a nice parade, and then they start complaining about taxes, which Jordan and I know very well about people complaining about taxes, and so yeah, it's kind of a funny. It all comes back again.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, Mary Jo, let me stop the recording here, if I could. I'll stop.